we go. All right, hello everyone. We're going to get started in a minute to just give people the chance to log in, but feel free to use the chat box to say hello and introduce yourself. All right, let's get started. Welcome everybody. This is Lauren Oglesby. I am the Coordinator of Content Communication and Programs at AIA New Orleans. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. This is the last webinar that we are putting on in 2020. And today we're going to hear from Fernando Ruiz from the Vinyl Siding Institute. A heads up about the format. All attendees will be muted, but you will be able to ask questions through the Q&A box or through the chat box. I will be monitoring those throughout the webinar, and Fernando will be taking questions at the end. A brief note about IT issues. If you run into any troubles, I'm afraid we are a small team, so we don't really have the capacity to troubleshoot for you, but I did email the call-in number to everybody today, this morning, for backup if Zoom doesn't work for you. And if you do end up calling in via your phone, please go ahead and email me your name and AIA number so I can get you CEU credit. All right, on the agenda today, I'm going to introduce our speaker, and then Fernando is going to talk on the topic of keeping traditional designs alive, the resilient benefits of polymeric exteriors. Our speaker today is Fernando Ruiz. On a technical level, Fernando Ruiz has a master's degree in green building, is an ICC certified residential building inspector, a realtor, and a Florida property insurance adjuster. He's worked as a consultant to the polymeric cladding industry for nearly 10 years, presenting both AIA accredited design and ICC accredited code seminars. Over a 30-year career in construction, Mr. Ruiz has become a dedicated proponent of building innovation in low-cost housing. His Liberty Village development won the National Association of Home Builders Workforce Housing Award, and he has pioneered advanced technology in housing with the PATH program. Always looking for a better way to build houses, Fernando authored Building the Affordable House, Trade Secrets for High-Value, Low-Cost Construction, and The Affordable Remodel, both of which were published by the Tauntaun Press, and most recently, The Architecture of Traditional Neighborhoods, published by the Vinyl Siding Institute. Welcome, Fernando. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And let's see, I know that you cannot give me any kind of technical support, but I'm hoping you'll at least confirm if I've got the right image on the screen for you.
Yep,
okay.
Can see.
Okay, very good. Well, we have a lot to go through, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started and tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about. We always have to do this at the beginning, and it's actually one of the AA requirements. So here we go. We're going to learn the basic tenets of traditional neighborhood design, wherefore it came and why. We're also going to learn a little bit about the basic tenets of traditional neighborhood architecture. Those are two different things, neighborhood design, neighborhood architecture, and I'll explain that. Then kind of the heart of the program is selecting the best fit modern materials to use in traditional exteriors. And we're going to see some concepts in resilient and urbanism in terms of material selection, since that's always a question that comes up, especially when we're talking about vinyl siding. Now, I should point out that this presentation is being sponsored by the Vinyl Siding Institute, and I do work as a consultant for them. I'm not a Vinyl Siding Institute employee per se. I am a designer and a boutique developer, if you will. That's my actual day job. The Vinyl Siding Institute, as you'll see a little bit as we talk about the evolution of cladding materials, its name dates itself. It's back from the 1970s and 80s when vinyl siding was had its heyday. The manufacturers or the members of the Vinyl Siding Institute now create a lot of different products, all of them PVC based, plastic based, but that's why I'm speaking about polymeric products, because you'll see that there's a whole range of different types of material besides vinyl siding. But to get started, I would like to ask you a few questions as a poll that's going to come up on your screen. I wouldn't mind if you would just give some brief responses. This is how kind of gauge the success of the presentation. So I'll give you a few minutes just to answer the poll. When I look off to my left here, I'm looking at what you're looking at. I have no idea if everyone's answered or not, so I guess as soon as everyone answers, we'll go on with the presentation.
We are getting some answers here, and please continue answering, and I'll let you know when everyone has answered.
Okay, well, to give you an incentive, those who answer, and if we can get your mailing address, we're going to send you a Starbucks gift card. You got to answer both polls, or the one at the beginning and the one at the end.
All right, let's give people 10 more seconds here.
Okay. You may believe you're just here to get the AA critics, but you'll actually enjoy this presentation, I believe. You got the answers, not often. Very good. That's how it always begins. All right, well, let's move on. Let's close that guy off the screen and let's reveal what's underneath. Are you able to close the poll off the screen?
Yeah, if it's still on your window, you can go ahead and close out of it yourself, I believe.
Oh, really? Okay. Let's see. It's still on my window. Oh, okay. I thought that was something you did. So what are we looking at? It's a beautiful image, isn't it? It's very pretty. It's the Temple of Hephaestus, built around 1410 BC. It's in Athens. It was for the god of fire, the father of Daedalus. It's the oldest surviving temple in Athens, but it's not the very first temple at this location. What was there before? What happened to it? Now, in person, I'd ask you, and somebody would inevitably raise their hand and give the correct answer. The earlier temple burnt down, and it did. Truly ancient buildings were wood. They were not stone, and the original temple was no exception. The Persians burnt it down, so the Greek, who were triumphant, rebuilt the temple with stone. The use of stone in the ancient world was reserved for civic, religious, and public structures. The vernacular, the houses and minor buildings, they were wood. So we don't know much about those buildings, in fact, because wood does what it always does. It's a biodegradable product, so they disappeared. We know a little bit about wood architecture from the Tuscan order of the columns, from stone, and from the writings of the ancient texts that told us a little bit about how they work. Because the Tuscan order was in wood, and so we don't really have any representations. We can't really go back and take a look at it and measure them and see what was up. But from the stone structures, we can get some basic characteristics of how the wood construction was done, and we can summarize, what was up. Where did these traditions come from? One of the reasons I start with this slide is architects often criticize products like vinyl siding or polymeric materials because they imitate wood, right? They imitate clapboard, they imitate wood products. They're not wood. So architects say, we like authenticity. We want a product that, that speaks of itself, its own nature. And I understand that. And I've communicated this to the vinyl siding manufacturers, and some are beginning to make uniquely vinyl types sidings that that are in a sense authentic to the material. But I bring this up because if we look carefully, we find that even the stone architecture was in fact an imitation of wood. Incidentally, this temple of Hephaestus, I mentioned that Hephaestus was the father of Daedalus. Daedalus was the first architect, mythological architect. He was supposed to be a very skilled architect and craftsman and artist, and he became the symbol of wisdom and knowledge. He designed the labyrinth of Crete that hid the Minotaur, and he was the father of Icarus, who was also a designer, but did not heed Daedalus, his dad's advice, to steer clear of the sun with his wings, with the wax sticking the feathers on the frame. So Daedalus is credited with many inventions, including woodworking tools, the saw, the axe, the plumb line, the glue. Again, a reference in the ancient world to stone construction. And I'll show you a little bit how this, how you can find echoes of the stone construction and, in the entablature. You're familiar with the grammar, or the inherited grammar, if you will, of architectural practice in the Western world. And this detail of the Temple of Hephaestus shows the old Doric order, column capital there, and the entablature that provides all the clues to our architectural syntax, a syntax that was derived from wood. Note the triglyphs. There's the triglyphs, the little, the three vertical lines there. And what do the triglyphs, what are they? Well, they're rafters, because in the ancient temples, the wood structure there held up the roof, and those represent rafter ends. And what are the gutai? The gutai, the little pegs on the bottom that hold the rafters in place. Today, they would be nails. The square metatopes, where the arrow points to the frieze and you have the little sculptural elements, what would those be today? Well, those are wood blocking to keep the rafters from tipping over. The architrave, what is it? Well, it's a beam. And now here's where stone modifies things a little bit. Just like any product, it has, it may be imitating something, but it's got its own innate structure. And stone changes things a little bit in terms of wood construction. Why? The limitations with stone come with its flexural, its tensile strength. So if this were a wood structure, the beam could carry a much wider span. In stone, the columns have to be very close together because stone doesn't carry, it carries, vertical weight, but it doesn't carry horizontally all that well. And we've gotten used to the spacing in columns. So when we see something with much, with widely spaced traditional, Greek or Roman columns, it looks goofy, right? Because we know that's not the architecture of the grammar, if you will, of our architecture. So that's why we have examples like the one on the right there, this, apartment building entrance. It looks stupid, right? The columns on the left, we all know, even if you're not an architect, they're too squat, and they've got the, the little bit of that convex shape to them, but they're too small to have that. And so there's a lot of syntactical errors that are made when trying to imitate classical architecture, basically because the blockhead builders that put this together have never taken a course in classical architecture and don't know what they're doing. So this is your responsibility to make sure this doesn't happen, because it ruins our built environment, if you will, when you see things like this. So where did our traditions come from? Our traditions are wood. And our traditions came from England, right? The classical revival during the Renaissance, where the Italian architects started to, study some of the ruins, and then various architects came and measured and looked and developed the proportions of the orders of architecture, and there was a revival of classical architecture, which of course spread in England, where our carpenters came from. You see, they came over as ship's carpenters, not as architects. Architects didn't come over the New World for a long time, but these ship carpenters, they kind of understood a little bit of the classical orders because they've been working on good architecture in England, and they made simple wood homes. There was plenty of trees in the New World. They made all their own stuff, their own windows, their own shingles, everything. And that's why these older houses, like this Cape Cod type home that we're looking at here. Why did they have the small windows and little doors and such? Well, you had to make all this stuff. You had a limited building season. And so, you know, they did the best they could. The typical material that they clad the buildings with was shake, not necessarily cedar shake, although cedar shake's become the most popular, but shake of some kind. The building traditions, which came originally from England, sort of spread westward and southward through the United States with the westward expansion slowly. And as the nation developed and there was a little bit more wealth, you began to have things like brick plants and things like, some stone structures. Again, if you look at any building that was put up, say, before the 1940s, it's pretty darn good. Any of these homes, they have a good, from the architectural perspective, they kind of follow the right lines and proportions and all. And this is not by coincidence. This is because the builders back then, and they were home builders. We have a home building tradition in the United States. In other words, designer builders, folks like me, except that the folks like me in the old days, they had a lot of respect for architecture and they studied books by people like yourself. They read books like The Country Builder's Assistants. Who is this written by? Asher Benjamin, the very first architect in the New World in the 1700s, 1797, end of the 18th century. This was, he was the first architect. He was one of the actually superintendents in the construction of our Capitol building. And there's also the American Vignola, published shortly thereafter by Will Ware, who claimed to codify Vignola for the American Renaissance. And he was the founder of the very first architectural schools in the Harvard Architectural School and others. These very first architects published books for builders. Today, the only book that the builders read is the IRC, the International Residential Code, which is a code to allow builders to build without contracting your services. That's the purpose of the book. And unfortunately, because there's no aesthetic education, there's no aesthetic codes, if you will, the result is, well, what we see in subdivisions and what's sort of polluted our built environment everywhere. And we're going to discuss a little bit how that came up. Now, yes, a kind of American vernacular developed in which, not all of the elements of classical architecture were followed strictly, but in general, the aesthetics were pretty good. And we have, that's why we like to go to the old towns in the US on our vacations, because there's nice buildings still, even if they were not designed by architects. On cladding, the main reason our traditional, except in the Southwest and in California where they used adobe, but why is it primarily wood, shake, clapboard? That's because the US once had plentiful woodlands, and because our builders, they came on wooden ships, they knew how to work with wood. There was no really need to have a brick mason or a stone mason on one of the the boats over from England. So the majority of the craftsmen were in fact carpenters, and that's how most home builders and even most draftsmen, I'm not talking architects here, I'm talking about draftsmen, how most draftsmen get their start. They get their start as carpenters, even today. So many areas had no stone at all, and the vernacular was always clad with wood. Only municipal buildings, this is eventually, if you travel throughout the United States and visit little towns, you'll see that all the buildings, all the houses, all the common vernacular structures are wood. The only masonry structures in the old towns were the courthouse, maybe the school, maybe the church, these municipal buildings that were, just like the Greek temples, built to last. Everything else was wood. And what was the main cladding? Certainly in the East Coast, it was cedar shake or some sort of shake. Why? Well, there were plenty of trees. The trees were quite fat. They were old growth trees. You could cut one down with a 2-man saw and then divide it into discs, like thick pizza pieces, if you will. Just slice it into discs. And then with a cedar axe, that's what you're looking at right there, or a shake axe, and a froe. Froe is that kind of hammer thing that you're looking at, that wooden hammer. You could, bang down, slice pieces off of this pie, if you will, slice little slices off of it, slivers off of it, and there you had it, cladding. It was like shingles, nail it up. So this is why you see cedar shake or imitation cedar shakes all over the East Coast, because this was the main material. Now, as the old growth trees were cut down and as you moved into areas with younger trees, then you began to get classic clapboard. Clapboard was made with slicing younger trees along the lengths of the thinner logs. So you wouldn't be cutting through, you make very tiny shingles, so you cut along the log to make really rather short pieces of clapboard. They were as long as a piece of lath. How as long was a piece of lath in the old days? Like, I'm talking lath here for like lath and plaster. It was about 48 inches long. That's how we got our 16-on-inch center framing. No structural value to 16 versus 19 versus 24. 16 was like, that was a good distance because a good guy with a hand axe could slice about 48 inches pretty reliably. If you got much longer, it was difficult to do. If you got shorter, well, you wanted to do it as long as possible. 48 inches became established as the length of a piece of lath or as the length of a piece of clapboard. So as you notice in this house that you're looking at, it was covered with seams all over the place, pieces butted together. Why? Well, the pieces were short. You can see it more clearly here. And they stacked the seams because it was easy to go up with one length and then, go up with the next length. Now, architects today despise the stacked seams of materials that imitate clapboard, right? Why don't we like the stacked seams? Well, we don't like the stacked seams because we're used to seeing clapboard in its more modern industrial version, like this house that you're looking at right there. As mills moved west and railroads could transport industrial products, we got the material we know today is clapboard, which is 16 feet long or longer. It was milled smooth and cut into pie-shaped panels, and it had to be painted. And painting exterior wood is very tricky. I have a whole course on construction with wood cladding, and one of the things that really stands out is that you need the right species of tree for the climate zone. It has to be dried correctly. It has to be milled correctly. It has to be transported correctly and acclimatized on site to the wherever it is that you're building. It has to be primed correctly, installed correctly with all the right flashings, and then painted correctly with one of these really good paints. One misstep in that chain and you get premature peeling, blistering, and all the issues that come with paint. Now you'll notice that this guy painting here on the right hand is using a latex glove. This is not an old paint. Old paints, man, they were very good. We had some fantastic old paints with lead and arsenic and all kinds of incredible chemicals, and it's still peeled and it's still blistered and it's still split and the wood still rot. Even these truly manly paints wimped out against the elements. And what did people have to do? How did us older guys like me get our start in the construction industry? Scraping off old paint. That's what I did summers in high school. Well, people got pretty tired of that. They got pretty tired of it, and industry decided to respond, and manufacturers developed new materials with durability in mind, i.e., you didn't need to scrape and paint every year. Now you'll notice that most of the new, in fact, I think almost all of the new, with the exception of one, of these modern sorts of cladding or exterior siding materials were originally developed for the recladding market, or the remodeling market, where you would you would put something like this beautiful asphalt-based faux brick siding panels called insul brick that were introduced in the 1930s by the Mastic Corporation. You put them right over the old siding. In fact, if you buy a house like this, one of the first things you do is you tear off that old asbestos siding, and then you have the old wood siding underneath it. Unfortunately, it's been drilled full of the nails used to install this asphalt siding. You end up having to rip it off and reside the house anyway. You'll also notice that the old materials, they were not actually imitating wood. They were always imitating stone and brick, which they did poorly. And that was because nobody had figured out how to create horizontal siding, like an industrial siding, like aluminum or metal, or the original metal siding was all imitating brick and wood too, because they couldn't figure out how to put the horizontal pieces so they wouldn't leak. And it was until the 1937 or so, an engineer developed a way of what is called the interlocking panels, which now is all of the materials have interlocking panels, and those interlocking panels, the top panel interlocks with the bottom panel. Those panels now, can prevent water from getting into the structure along those long horizontal seams. But until then, everything was imitating either stone or brick. Even the metal siding did. Eventually, aluminum siding came into the market in 1947, and then shortly thereafter, Crane introduced the first vinyl siding in the 1950s. And it was very popular because it was a lot less expensive than aluminum. Aluminum was a fairly expensive material. Unfortunately, because it was inexpensive, it clad over some very regrettable architecture. Nonetheless, price, dollars, money talks. The price point of vinyl siding made it very popular, and it overtook aluminum and reigned supreme into the 1980s. Vinyl siding in 2002 even had about 40% of the market share in the US and Canada. However, durability also entails lovability. And a new movement was about to be born in the 1980s that did not embrace any of these industrial innovations. In fact, as you'll see, they hated them. Now, much of the market share gained by vinyl came with the post-war boom in tract housing. After the war, after World War II, the GI Bill afforded accessible mortgages, and the American dream, it really took hold. It went to fire. That's really when the idea of the American dream as owning a house became, synonymous with being an American. So to meet the need, our carpenters became home builders, and our home builders became developers, and they embraced all the manufacturing techniques of Henry Ford to develop massive vertically integrated housing tracts and the new phenomena of the merchant builder or cookie cutter development. They had to put up thousands of houses, and they figured it out how to do it, inspired by manufacturing. Big builders took advantage of the automobile and our nation's growing freeway network to buy cheap agricultural land in the cornfields, giving birth to the far-flung automobile-dependent suburbs where many of us still live. Now the cities often have to grow contiguously. You can't develop like 20 miles out in the cornfields. You have to develop right next to the city center. A lot of cities develop that because of the cost of bringing infrastructure out to those far-flung subdivisions. But at first, that was not the case. If the car could get there, or if you could build a road to get a car there, that's where you could get your cheap land. That's where you could put up your affordable housing, if you will, stuff that you could purchase with a VA mortgage or an FHA mortgage. And they called them the vinyl jungles. All over the place, the tract housing was being developed, and people had a natural reaction to it, again, because the architecture wasn't very good, and so they were kind of nameless, very there wasn't a lot of love involved in these subdivisions. It was really based on price, and again, vinyl siding was price point, so there was a lot of vinyl siding. But a sea change came with a project called SEASIDE in Florida. It began, and you probably know about this project, I'm sure. It was a small resort community on the Gulf of Mexico. Many of you know the community. Maybe you vacationed there because it was the set of the perfect home in the Truman Show with Jim Carrey. And it's also a historical landmark as the birthplace of 20th century new urbanist design. Now, the backstory, in 1978, developer Robert Davis, that was the guy who was responsible for this development initially, inherited a 75-acre parcel from his grandfather. And he decided, because he was a good grandson, to fulfill his grandfather's dream for this land by creating old-fashioned beach town with wood frame cottages traditional of the Florida Panhandle. Now, his bankers, they didn't like the idea. They advised him to build condos. But Davis insisted, instead of building the condominium towers commonly found along the Florida coast, he hired a pair of young architects, and this was Andres DUANY and his partner Elizabeth Platter ZYBERK, and he conveyed his grandfather's wishes, his vision, And the architects, they loved it. They thought, this is fantastic. They set out to find a model for this neo-traditional style of development, and they researched tourist destinations like, you guessed, New Orleans, Key West, Savannah, Charleston. They studied these. They did a kind of forensic analysis of why are these towns successful? Why do people travel hundreds, if not thousands of miles from other countries to hang out in New Orleans? Why? And they discovered that some of the riches of these successful historical examples to use as a seaside, to use as a template for their new project in Seaside. And these riches included traditional architecture, mixed use, walkability, and sociability. Now, mixed use, walkability, and sociability, they're all related in the pedestrian scale of development. If you can walk around, if you can get to the store quickly, if you can, have kind of an area to be that's a small human scale, i.e. walkable neighborhood, then, what begins there, or what takes off there is a community, the creation of community, which is what was absent in these, far-flung tract housing, which were completely car dependent, where you could get in and out of the neighborhood quickly, and you could, had a long driveway, but you didn't know who your neighbor was. So these were the elements that they took to Seaside. And if you look at the picture of Seaside, you'll see that clustered along the street grid, and you'll see a little bit later how it worked, but radiating from the town center, this community consists of low-rise houses primarily, the wood frame cottages of the Panhandle, that was the architectural model, designed with traditional roof lines and featuring picket fences, traditional architecture. Now, this just happened to be one of the elements. Traditional architecture is not necessarily, the basis, but it's the most visible. It's sort of what really, came out of this movement, although the central idea was about planning. So one of the architect's most radical prescriptions, if you will, for Seaside called for exploiting the choicest real estate, typically where you put the biggest and the best and the most expensive condo. The choicest real estate on the property was for public use, not even good commercial use, public use, a park, a post office. And you'll notice even on the next picture how the beachfront overlook is the centerpiece of the community with a public square and a marketplace around it with some light retail. So the housing densities were also higher. It's one of the features of the new urbanist design is higher housing densities, but it wasn't for the usual profit motive of trying to cram in as many homes as possible per acre, but rather so residents could live within easy walking distance of the stores, the post office, and the beach. Walkability, an important element in this new style of urbanism. So the Seaside Building Code mandated porches close to the sidewalk, no private lawns, turf was only used for public parks, crosstown footpaths and benches, as well as many other planning elements designed to promote spontaneous neighborly interactions, sociability, places where people could meet. The Seaside concept caused an immediate sensation. It was one of these things that we would now call viral. The architects became like revolutionaries, and Andres and Elizabeth's design philosophy became known as the new urbanism. Actually, Stefan Polizoidis invented the term, the new urbanism, but the architects wrote a best-selling manifesto, they created a planning credo, and it happened to coincide what was then, in the 1980s, a budding environmental movement. This was also the beginning of the, the lead of kind of the green building movement. So Seaside, the new urbanism, it all meshed with other tendencies, all other trends that were just beginning to take shape and to become more popular at that time. And it became the antidote to the polluting, automobile-dependent suburban sprawl that had overtaken the United States. Now, attesting to how significant the movement became, the design firm founded by DUANY and ZYBERK, known as DPZ in Miami, DPZ, it's created more than 500 towns around the world, 500 new towns, and it's worked on remodeling and recasting and redeveloping about 1,500 redevelopments. Now, the fundamental aspect of new urbanism is not traditional architecture per se, so much as traditional neighborhood planning, which we're going to get into a little bit. The architectural aspect became the most influential and recognizable. You all know that the new urbanism had a big effect. Well, the new urbanism was inspired by New Orleans. It also had a big impact on at least the area surrounding New Orleans right after Katrina in 2005. DUANY's Miami-based architecture and planning firm played a major role in the reconstruction of the hurricane-devastated areas of Louisiana outside New Orleans. And of course, in Mississippi, they played a major role in Mississippi. The Katrina Cottage, you all know that, it was coined by one of the new urbanist architects, Marianne Cusato, the Katrina Cottage. But back to Seaside. Let's look at how Seaside was developed and why it introduced the idea of neighborhood standards or a code on which you can design. The developer didn't have a lot of money. You remember the bankers didn't like the concept he was working with, and they wanted him to build condos, and he wanted to build this weird old style town that they weren't sure how well it was going to work on what was then called the Redneck Riviera. It wasn't like a tourist destination. They were going to create one in the middle of nowhere, a little like Las Vegas, you know, created a tourist destination in the middle of the desert. These guys were working on sort of the same idea. Build it and they will come. So they didn't have a lot of money to do a vertically integrated subdivision where they would, you know, plat it and build the streets and the infrastructure and build all the homes and provide the financing. And it wasn't that kind of project. So with limited funds, what did they do? Instead of creating instead of building it out, they created a code with which it would be built out. They created one of the first neighborhood design codes. And so once the streets were in and they weren't even paved and people began to build their houses there, they would hire an architect or a builder, and they had this code. Said, here's your code. You got to build according to this code. And that's how the neighborhood shaped up. Now, architects love this because they could now do projects and develop the neighborhood code in addition to designing the buildings, the structures within it. So again, it became very popular. But if we look at the Seaside Code, and we're just looking at a little portion of it, you'll see two items. Item 2, it says, walls may be clad in wood siding, shakes, shingles, or vertical wood, board, and batten. The wood shall be rot resistant, like cedar, redwood, cypress, may be pressure treated and finished to prevent rot. Then you go to item 7, it says, synthetic wood and cementitious trim are prohibited. Nothing fake. We want real materials, real wood. In other sections, real steel, real stone, whatever it is, you've got to work with natural materials. Now you can see how this was not very good for the vinyl siding industry. It wasn't good for the fiber cement industry or any of the synthetic materials, but that's how it started. And that's where the decline of materials like vinyl siding came in. You see, DPZ's concepts over time inspired scores of neo-traditional projects. This slide shows a new urbanist community in Longmont, Colorado. It's called Prospect. It's one of the famous ones. It was developed by developer Kiki Wallace, and you can see the influence of Seaside in this development. Front porches close to the sidewalks, picket fences, narrow streets, wide sidewalks, lots of wood trim. By now, you all know that the purpose of the iconic front porch of the new urbanism, although it's sort of picked up from the South, it's not to play checkers on with a pipe in your mouth. It's really a very urbane condition geared to facilitate spontaneous social interaction with the neighbors, sidewalk to front porch. So walkable community, people are walking around, you're standing on your front porch, hey neighbor, and you see they're even keeping a respectable social distance, even though they don't have masks on there. They're at least 6 feet apart because of the front porch. The front porch mediates the interaction between the public and the private realm. As you'll see here, this is the social transect, beginning at the public realm, moving up the private sidewalk, up the walkway towards the front porch, a semi-public private place with street side visibility and positioned close enough to converse with someone standing on the sidewalk. Then, if and when the relationship warrants it, we step into the living room. The living room is a private yet social realm for close friends and family. And then the transect continues into the intimate areas of the home, the kitchen, the bedrooms, you know, the bathrooms, etc. But you can see how it's a social transect mediating the public to the private realm. And that's the basis of why front porches and the basis of why narrow front yards, so you're up close to the action, if you will. And the idea here is not, it is an aesthetic thing. It looks much better than giant driveways, you know, with a house at the end. But it also, the intent was to mediate and create community. And you'll find community, by the way, if you go to one of these urbanist neighborhoods, you visit them, whatever, you go to Celebration or you go to Seaside, any of them, you will find community there. Now, traditional neighborhoods existed before automobiles by definition, and hence streets were designed for people. In this example, you'll see the narrow pavement with cars parked along both sides of the street. This makes it uncomfortable to drive. You must slow down to navigate between the cars. Street trees planted along a strip of turf serve to shade the sidewalk, but also bulwark pedestrians. And it signals drivers, you know, as they're passing the trees, you know, you get that repetitive rhythm of the trees, and you can kind of sense your speed. So all of this is designed to slow the traffic down. It's a little bit uncomfortable. You want to park as soon as possible and just walk to where you're going. And the walking is comfortable. The sidewalks are wide. The rhythm of the architecture is uninterrupted by wide driveways. That doesn't mean you don't have to have any driveways at all. You see a driveway right there in the picture, but it's a narrow driveway. It widens towards where the garage is, so you can have a two-car garage sort of in the back of the house. But the idea, again, is to create a nice, interesting rhythm of homes or buildings to look at. Nice detailed architecture, much more interesting place to walk around, especially if you're walking around the same old neighborhood, walking your dog or your kid or whatever, day in and day out. It's more interesting than the lonelier sidewalks of suburbia. Here's a contrast between the conventional on top and the traditional neighborhood design below. You can see how the traditional neighborhood was not so much architecture as planning. Here you see the conventional development pattern, just kind of a typical one. We see on the left-hand side, single family with wide streets, big lots, no sidewalks, if any. The lots afford privacy. You can get in and out of this neighborhood easily. At the center of the community, right in the middle, there's an amenity. Maybe it's a golf club, maybe it's a pool, but in any case, it's a destination. It's not an on-the-way place. It's not a place you happen to walk at as you're going towards somewhere else. It's a destination. You dress up, you get in your car, you park there, and then you go with your swimsuit or your polyester pants to golf, whatever. It's a place. You got to be a member of that club. No dogs allowed. On the right, you've got a cluster of multifamily, separate from the single family to segregate property values. Very concerned we don't get that cheap housing next to our expensive house. And by extension, enfranchisement, social enfranchisement. Those people live in apartments, we live in homes. Social value is segregated, but the apartments try and mimic some of the benefits of suburban living. They promise privacy, central amenities. Conventional development also typically isolates itself. It offers maybe one or two access points into the community, mostly concerned with emergency egress, an exit. But it's not connected. It's not connected to the old neighborhood. It's hard to get over to the old neighborhood. You got to get in your car, drive over to the old neighborhood, and then walk around. The green space, even when plentiful, even when acres of green space are afforded, it remains wild. It's mostly unused. It's like big sort of parklands or forested areas. You rarely find any commercial use in a modern subdivision, except maybe the pro shop or the church or a school. You can't walk over to the bar. You got to drive over the bar, which is a problem because then you got to drive home from the bar too. Now, a neo-traditional community, that's the one below, it occupies about the same geographic area as the one above, but with much higher density and a blend of unit types. and a traditional street grid, even with shortcuts. So you don't have to walk down to the corner to the intersection to cross over to the other parallel street, because again, this is geared to walking. It's harder to parse this neighborhood into areas of use, single family, amenity, and multifamily. That's because you'll find different uses all mixed throughout the neighborhood. Buildings face one another like we would if we were conversing right now across the table. We would, be looking sideways or turning our backs to each other the way houses do in a kind of modern suburban conventional subdivision. Trees line the streets. The developer would emphasis on many public places throughout, parks for people instead of empty wildlands. And whenever possible, the community offers many points of connection to the neighboring neighborhoods. As you see at the bottom of the sketch, it's a connected community in every way. Here we see the developer sacrifice 2 building lots for a pocket park and community garden. The developer makes up for the lost revenue with those 2 lots with higher property values adjacent to the amenity. Because property located adjacent to the amenity is always more expensive. So he sacrifices 2 lots, but he didn't sacrifice 2 pennies in doing so. Multifamily conditions, very similar, kind of a central park, common areas, almost a townhouse appearance rather than, you can have density in a big old, multi-story building, but no community whatsoever. You have to find a way of getting people to cross one another, to interact with one another in order to do that. So along with proximity, narrow lots, and lively streetscapes, you find neighborhood-friendly architecture. This is where we're sort of getting into the meat of the presentation today, and most of it is traditional in style. And by neighborhood-friendly architecture, I mean there's a concern with the block face versus the individual units. No trophy homes, just a pretty street. So when you're designing one of these, you're not focused on the impact of the individual home, you're focused on the impact of the neighborhood, of the streetscape. And a style involves a whole building, of course, the massing as well as the ornamentation. There's no Mr. Potato Head homes in a traditional neighborhood development. And conventional developers always talk about their Mr. Potato Head homes, where you have the basic floor plan, if you will, and then you put different ornamentation on it. So there isn't a basic repeatable floor plan that you can reproduce anywhere in the nation, putting a few brackets to create a craftsman in one location, some exposed diagonal beams in another to make it a Tudor, some gingerbread elsewhere and it's a Victorian. Home styles involve more than ornamentation, if you will. It involves the whole building. It's a volume and a shape, even more so than the ornamentation, I would argue. The illustrations you're going to see, that you've seen and that you're going to see, all come from the book that we put together with the Vinyl Siding Institute called Architectural Design for Traditional Neighborhoods. And we deal with all these elements that we've been talking about in depth, more in depth. You can obtain a copy of the book at the, I'll show you the website at the end of this presentation at vinylsiding.org. You can get a copy in the mail, or you can just download a PDF version of it free right there on the website. And you'll notice that the co-authors here, my co-authors are some very good architectural firms that dedicate themselves to creating these kinds of traditional neighborhoods. Now, after some of these presentations, architects contact me to get tips on how to specify vinyl siding within the context of this traditional neighborhood architecture, so it doesn't scream vinyl siding, and I provide these tips. But because of these follow-up emails and phone calls and the sort of individual work with an individual architect that's putting together maybe a community design standard, and they want some less expensive homes and they want to include vinyl siding, got an idea that there's kind of a detailed information that's necessary. You're going to see some beautiful pictures of vinyl sided homes, and you're going to say, well, how did they achieve that? Because the vinyl sided homes in my neighborhood don't look like that. Well, this is we're going to be publishing in 2021 kind of a master specifications, if you will, that will detail exactly, these are the details to achieve this appearance. How do you deal with the stacked seams? How do you deal with the J channel? How do you deal with all these elements that are negatives on conventional vinyl siding installations, if you will? How to get around them? What are the workarounds? And also a description of, well, what are the different materials available? Because builders typically don't use the full array of materials, so you don't see it all over the place. You'll see it in this presentation, but you won't see it in your neighborhoods. That way, kind of what's what you can get, what you can order from the supply house. So that's coming in 2021. We're just going to give you a preview, let you know. So while the soul of the traditional neighborhood is not nostalgic architecture, it's pedestrian and community-oriented neighborhood, the traditional architecture has become the most salient and recognizable feature of these type of developments. This is where all of you come in. Perhaps some of you recognize the fellow sitting on the left, Steve Buzan. He's one of the original town architects of the new urbanism, and he wrote the excellent and highly recommended book, Traditional Construction Patterns. It's published by McGraw-Hill. You should buy it if you're not familiar. You should absorb it. It's very well written, and it's conversant in our modern language. Some of these old, like the American Vignola, try and get through that. It's tough. We don't talk that way anymore. But this is a modern book doing essentially the same thing. So the new urbanism, because it was based on this idea of the neighborhood design standard, it turned many otherwise respectable working architects into code writers and plan reviewers tasked with enforcing the community design guidelines. And why? Because it's not so much a reflection of new urbanist dogma. It's not the architectural police state, in other words. It's a reflection of the state of our architects, yes, and builders who no longer have the benefit of a classical education. If you're doing traditional architecture, you got to know something about traditional architecture. We've forgotten the architecture of traditional neighborhoods. Steve did some of the drawings that follow too, but our book was a little bit to revive, well, if you're going to do this, this is what you need to be aware of, and this is how you can do it using modern materials, i.e. synthetic claddings. So to start, the architecture of traditional neighborhood begins at the block face. It's not focused as much on the individual building as the overall environment created by the company of buildings along the street. You know this when you travel to a historical place because you have precisely a sense of place. You urbanists talk about place making. In other words, they don't talk so much about cladding or even architecture. They talk about place making. So to design a block face or the row of buildings along the block, you have to consider the style of the buildings. Do they emphasize verticality? Do they emphasize horizontality? In other words, would Victorians and mid-century modern styles blend along the same street? No. Why not? Well, it's not just ornamentation. It's also the massing of the building and the emphasis of that building on either verticality or horizontality. So could you create a traditional neighborhood using mid-century modern homes? Absolutely. Go to Palm Springs and you'll see some. It's not one type of architecture or another, but it's there is some a sense of place, that there's some I don't want to use the word homogeneous architecture, but compatible architecture, if you will, styles that work together on the same block face. We give some instruction on that in the book, and incidentally, Denver is a place where there's a lot of different architectural styles. Well, how do you get them to work? Well, we've figured 5 different traditional architectural styles in the Denver area, and we kind of have this table that shows you, well, how you can blend them. These 3 work together on the same block. These 2 work together, but these 2 don't. So you can use that kind of as a tool for traditional neighborhood design, block face design, because neighborly homes, they have simple, elegant massing, like the house on the right? They don't feature flamboyant, highly individual styles because these architectural personalities don't create harmony or placemaking. They may be really cool. Uncle Bill, he's got all these great stories and all, but it's kind of hard to sit across the table from because it's too much. And so a lot of modern architecture and the architecture of the more affluent conventional subdivisions is too much. It needs to be almost in its own place, you know, like on a pedestal. And you see that in the builder, you know, they develop their brochures and they always show a house, even if it's a townhouse, mind you, and there's no town, there's nothing next to it. Just like a car, when they advertise a car, the car is in a lonely place. You know, it's in a frozen lake, or it's on a beautiful country road. It's never shown in traffic on an LA freeway. But the fact is, homes are in the context of their neighborhood, so they have to be neighborhood compatible. And along the same vein is calming, harmonious architecture. We want to limit the number of materials used. Some municipalities have, you know, kind of taken up the idea of neighborhood design, and in order to bring up the value, they've used this crude coding language to elevate the property values by requiring, say, a percentage of masonry. Usually it's 30%, like the house on the left-hand side, which ends up creating some terrible errors of syntax, if you will. This house, it looks like it has this massive foundation, right, of stone, but it's like a girdle, right? It goes up too high. It's built up to the windows, as if a fellow had pulled his, you know, his pants up way too high. You know, like old men, they pull their pants up too high. I do that now as I get older too. I pull my pants up high because otherwise they slip down. So it looks stupid, right? We make fun of that. We have the whole supply houses full of cladding. Everything's there. They have stone, shake, clapboard, everything on there. Everything you got in the supply house, it's on that house. Now look at the elegant folk Victorian, if you will, next door on the right-hand side. It has a masonry base too, but you cannot see it. It's the foundation. Otherwise, there's one cladding material, clapboard, period. It's a little bit understated, but much more beautiful. I know you all agree. Let's look at some details. Brick mold, a modern material, it should go with brick. In some parts of the country, they call this a stucco mold too, stucco ground, because, you know, some places have brick, some places have stucco. But either way, this molding has a little rabbet or a groove along the edge called a plaster key, and it goes with masonry products that have plaster, either stucco or brick, and this allows the material to kind of tuck into this plaster key or this little groove that hides the crack that develops between the masonry and the wood door and the masonry wall. And it comes, it's very similar in a sense to the J-channel in vinyl siding that hides the expansion and the contraction. It allows the meeting of two dissimilar materials to work. But you know, siding, cladding, siding, clapboard has its own trims, like the picture on the right, and they look much better with siding that does brick molding, so avoid it. Window pane should be tall and narrow if you're doing traditional architecture. Of course, in modern architecture, there's, you know, picture windows and giant windows, and, you know, this doesn't apply. But window pane should be tall and narrow. There's a whole theory about the golden mean in the windows and exactly the proportions. Generally speaking, just tall and narrow like your face, so that you can walk up to the window and look out of it without one of the mullions, you know, or right between your eyes. This is typical of the 18th and 19th century neighborhoods. Shutters should shut. They shouldn't be screwed on next to the jambs. Shutters should shut. They should be hinged on the jambs, just like a door is hinged on the jamb. You don't nail the door to the wall on the side. And, you know, so now the shutter should be hinged on the jamb, and they should be the right size for the window so they look like they could shut, even if they don't. The frieze. This is a typical builder mistake. You remember the entablature that we were looking at before, and from your first year in your architectural school? The frieze should be wider than the cornice. The frieze represents what? Well, it represents a beam, really. That it represents the rafter ends, but most, you get an architrave, it could be to a beam. It's got to be wider than the cornice. What does the cornice represent? It represents a gutter. That's what it was. A much more elegant termination than the pork chop style rake, inspired by chicken coop vernacular that's on the left. is the classic Eve return that at least pays respect to the entablature, wherefore comes our basic architectural grammar. What am I getting at? Drive down any neighborhood street and you could immediately see the difference between the work of an architecturally illiterate builder and a trained architect. It looks more like this. Relief. These are not classical facades, if you will, but they're details well done with all plastic materials, incidentally. So this is what I'm going to show you, that you can do good architecture using things like vinyl siding or polymeric materials. The next time you see a really crummy looking vinyl sided house, blame the designer, not vinyl. It's not the material's fault. It's the fault of the way it's used. Getting back to Seaside, where all of this began, where the downfall of vinyl siding began, if you will, they had to change the code because at Seaside, they got tired of painting too. Their wood rotted. The place was going downhill. The homeowners complained. They went to the DRB, the Design Review Board, and said, hey, we don't want to keep painting every year. My place is looking run down. And the Design Review Board relented. And in 2017, just barely 3 years ago, they amended the covenants to allow for wood or simulated wood when used and when finished to appear as durable and authentic as the materials they simulate. Or as Steve Mouzon is fond of saying, if you're going to fake it well. And this is precisely what manufacturers have been doing, making aesthetically suitable replacements for wood with better functionality. And we'll take a look at some of the durable architectural materials that are good looking. Polypropylene shake. Polypropylene is an injection molded plastic. Because it's cast in a mold and the mold is cast on the original material, the polypropylene siding, in this case CEDAR shake, takes on the exact characteristics of the original. Now you'll note the color technology has improved greatly too, and this material is variegated, has a little verdigris to it at the perfect point. It doesn't get any grayer and than this. It stays like I would like to have stayed, at my 32 years old would have been ideal. No more verdigris. So this is like that a little bit. The material is made to kind of get to its perfect point and stay there. Yeah, that's unnatural, but hell, I wouldn't mind it for myself. This is Celia.
Hey, yep. Fernando, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we are at time, actually. This has been you are just a wealth of information. This has been great. I wonder if our attendees wouldn't mind staying for 5 more minutes. Do you think you can wrap up in five more minutes or so?
Yeah, I can just show the different types of material that are available.
Great.
So here we're looking at cellular PVC. Now you're familiar with this because you use it for moldings. This is the stuff vinyl windows are made out of, and synthetic wood decking. This is pretty acceptable, even kind of among architects. And you can obtain all type of cellular PVC siding and exterior trim as well. The material is solid. You can tap on it and it sounds like wood, and it makes excellent sharp corners and edges. This is more expensive than vinyl siding, but it's available, and it's a very good looking, very durable material. Now you might not know about polyash. It's a blend of polyurethane and glass fiber. And the reason it's called polyash is that the fly ash that's in the material comes from coal burning power plants. So it's kind of a green material. The material generally comes without color. Like fiber cement, you paint it. Unlike fiber cement, you can cut miters into it. You can use a router to shape it and drill it just like wood. So you can actually get mitered corners if you want them. Polyash is, because it has glass fiber, like surfboards, motorboats, not wood cellular fibers, as does fiber cement and the wood fiber products. Polyash absorbs no moisture. There's no adverse effect on the paint, no spalling in the freeze-thaw climates. And as you can see in the picture, you can put it right up against the rake of the roof, or right up against the masonry, right up against grate if you want to. It's also fire resistant. In fact, it's one of the relatively small group of materials that are allowed for the WUI designated buildings in California. WUI is wildland urban interface. I don't know if you have that in New Orleans, but it's the strictest fire zones. That's the point I'm making. So this material is fire resistant. It will not rod, you can put it right up next to your rakes. You can put it right on the masonry or grade, and it'll work just fine. Last of all, the most common cladding, vinyl siding. This is not even a select type of vinyl siding. You know, vinyl siding comes in a couple grades. You can get much higher grade vinyl siding that's smooth, that has a flat face. This is just the ordinary stuff that architects tend to disregard as an architectural product. But here, a designer used good taste and excellent material specifications as to the colors and trim. That's vinyl trim, incidentally. And we have a gorgeous Italianate that you would not turn your nose up when driving past. In fact, you would not think of vinyl siding. You would think cool house. So you only notice vinyl when the material has the misfortune of cladding over ugly architecture with poor detailing. When it's done well, like here, you don't think vinyl, you respond emotionally to the beauty of the building. And this is your responsibility as designers, using the elements of style with siding, accessories, and trim to create both beautiful, durable, and lovable structures. Now, I would very much appreciate it, before you go, you would answer the last poll.
All right, and I'm going to launch that right now. Oops, hold on. All right, there you go. And if anyone has any questions and you want to type those into the chat box or the Q&A box, feel free. Well, thank you so much again, Fernando. This was, like I said, just really, really interesting. And I think everyone has learned a lot. I know I did. I mean, I'm not an architect, but I feel like I learned a lot.
I should point out as well that one cool feature on this little house that you're looking at is the gutters. Those are vinyl gutters too.
Wow.
And they're a lot cheaper than the copper version of the same thing.
Okay, we'll give everybody a couple more seconds to answer. And again, you can put your address, your mailing address in the chat box.
And we'll need to get those, of course.
Yes, I will. A few people have put theirs in and I will send those to you. And
we'll also need the email addresses to send the AA certificate for the class. Now, yep. Alex, who's I think on the somewhere in the Zoom call, but not presenting, he will report your AA credits directly to AIA with your AA number. So it's important that he have that, the AA number, and then I'll send you by email the certification. Great, yeah. We will be in touch with those, with the numbers. And we have everybody's email address from registration that I will send to you. All right, thank you very, very much. I appreciate the invitation. So yeah, here's, do you see the poll results? No, I don't. I only see, let's see, 25%, 25%, 25%. After they said how likely were to specify, I don't see there. All right, well, I'll figure out a way to share the poll results with you. Okay, I hope they're good. I don't know. They look good. Yeah, they look great. Well, good. All right. Thank you so much, y'all. Thank you. And everybody, we hope you are staying safe and healthy. Have a great holiday season. And Fernando, thank you so much again. Okay. Bye-bye. It's been a real pleasure. Goodbye.